Next question. How does your TacOp and Kill Team selection change when on Open versus ITD? Are there some things that you should prioritize more?
Yes, this is a great question, right? Because there are quite a lot of key differences between the two. So, everyone knows that in ITD, mission actions are actually quite a lot more important because, realistically, you need to get through these doors. And turn one, you can open them all up if you want to, but that might mean that your opponent has easier access to your models, and you don't necessarily want to do that. So if you have a free mission action, suddenly you can open doors and you can move through to objectives. But also on turn one, it might let you actually get to some objectives, because some of the maps, you need those mission actions to be able to get through the doors and then get to the objectives. So mission actions are really, really important. So in kill team selection, I think you need to look at that. So what methods do you have of achieving this? And when I say kill team selection, I mean like actually choosing which kill team to use as well as which models to bring right within your kill team, because some kill teams don't have any access to these things and they really, really struggle, but some do. So Pathfinders recently have just got a buff to get basically a whole bunch of free mission actions, because it used to just be their Shaz Wee. So now it's like, okay, actually I can predict what I want to be able to do and use Koyon when I need to be able to use those mission actions, and that's going to affect how I play them in ITD. But pre that, you might go, with only the Shaz Wee having the free mission actions, this is going to be really hard to do, and I'm not going to risk it. So look at that. And if you have a certain model that can do that, or a certain bit of equipment, whatever it is, then look at probably taking it. It has significantly increased value in ITD. But when it... So when it then comes to TacOps selection, and let's stick on kill team selection whilst we're here, I guess. So there's a few other things that I think are important. Long range has less validity, but it's still useful. Don't get me wrong, but it has less validity in ITD. It's less important, right? So having it is really nice because you can do some cool stuff with guard, or you can stop people from just holding angles really far back and all that sort of stuff. But when you start getting to like the advanced play in ITD, you'll find that a lot of people, unless you have ignore obscurity, all of their guard moves that you care about are going to be obscured anyway, right? So they're not going to give you a free shot with a plasma cannon or plasma gun, whatever, turn one. So instead, you might start thinking about, what I actually need is a bit more mobile killing potential. So having heavy is actually very, very restrictive. So let's take breaches, for example. I could take a las volley, but unless I know exactly which room I'm going to put it in, and I know that they've got long sight lines, it might be a massive waste, right? So if I know I have to be moving up to get within 2 inches of people, then suddenly this trading game doesn't work. So look for that in your team as well. Now, talking about TacOps. So TacOps, there is quite a lot of changes. So the first thing is just like understanding that your opponent's board edge and drop zone is actually a lot harder to get to, right? So like you have a lot further to go to achieve that objective on most maps, because also a lot of secondaries are tied to kill zone edge or board edge, which means it's not their deployment zone, which is like the whole square forwards, but it's right at the back. So you actually sometimes have to be beyond the furthest heavy wall that there is in ITD, and you're going to have to get through at least 2 doors to get there. So you got to take into consideration how far you're moving. So let's say you're playing Hearthkin, and you're looking at something that's get basically across the board all the way to where your opponent is. Well, that's going to be so hard to do, right? Because you've got to move through doorways, you have limited routes. You've got to try and get that distance, and suddenly you've got to. So it's tough, right? So maybe look at other options that you have rather than those sorts of secondaries. I think it's also worth noting that on ITD, generically, turning point 1 is pretty much a wasted turn for scoring TacOps, right? Like there are very few TacOps you can score turning point 1 in ITD. I think you can maybe do recover item, but it can be quite easy to contest with a lot of teams. But generically, TP1 is wasted. So if you're looking at like, can I run a team that's going to run away on the points really early? It's hard to do that on ITD, on turning point 1 at least. The other thing I'd say about ITD is the way that the maps are built generically is it can sometimes be really hard to reposition models effectively, right? So, and this has advantages and disadvantages, right? So, like, let's say you're playing security, all right, and you think to yourself, okay, I'm playing security and I want to take like C's hatchway or something like that, C's access point, sorry, or I'm playing escort operative, or whatever it's going to be, right? I think you have to look at it in a sense of, okay, what area of the board am I happy to just stall on, like commit minimum resources to, and what side of the board am I going to like steamroll and force a significant advantage in it? And so I think we were talking about in the Discord the other day, the idea of a failed flank or I guess a false flank. So trying to see like, oh, can I just commit, let's say, like 2 or 3 models to that flank, just enough to get the objective on turn 1, turn 2. So I'm not going down on points, right? Like I want to maintain at least 3 points on turning point 1 and turning point 2. But on turning points 3 and 4, I'm happy to lose that flank. I genuinely don't care. They can have it, over to them, right? Because on the opposite flank, I'm going to make a significant amount of ground. I'm going to start taking primaries from them on that flank. And that's where I'm going to be scoring my secondaries as well. And that's something that I would say to try and look at. So I guess the main points that I'm going to come away from this is, don't underestimate the value of those free mission actions, especially if you're on an action-based primary. That becomes so important. Don't underestimate how far you need to go to get to your opponent's drop zone or board edge, right? Like you need to be moving up the board on turn 2 so that your turn 3 move is sufficiently far enough that you can make it there on turn 4, right? So like turn 1, fine, whatever, but like you need to keep forward momentum, and if you don't, you're going to lose points. And then potentially look at that, where can I afford to commit models and where can I afford to just stall? Do I need to actually fully commit stuff here? And can I just go, what, actually, I'm going to throw the majority of my weight at this flank over here. And on quite a lot of the ITD maps, you'll see that there's like a route to the central room. So if you overcommit too much on say the right flank, you can get back into the center, but there's no way your guys on the right flank are going to get to the left flank. All right. So look at that and try and figure out, but you can usually overwhelm on a certain area. So I guess like that was kind of like, it's very hard for me to answer it directly in a sense of, what TacOps am I going to take? Because I think it's so dependent on what your opponent plays. It's so dependent on the team that you're bringing. And when it comes to kill team selection, it's so matchup based, right? And that's kind of the beauty of kill team, but also difficulty is I can't just give you you just take these 3 TacOps and you take this operative every time because that's the answer. But I think generically, the main things that I would say is you want to try and look at TacOps that if you can play the mid board really well and you can sit in the mid board, that's great. If you can stall and you can just hide behind doors and still score your TacOps, that's great. And I think if you are committing to a TacOp or an archetype that requires a lot of forward momentum, then really look at like overwhelming the flank that you need to achieve it, and try to make back your primaries in the air in taking away your opponent's primaries on that flank as well. And then just see how much you can stall on the opposite flank is probably how I'd try and run that. But any thoughts, Conor, from your experience on ITD of how your TacOps selection changes or anything like that?
Well, just one thing from my experience is oh my god, Blast can be amazing on ITD. Just particularly, I'm thinking from the Sorcerer, and it's also ITD is probably the one scenario where I'm thinking, do you know what, with Legionary, I might even take the missile launcher just to really muck about and get in the head of my opponent as they worry about all that blast. But I wanted to expand, if we could, on your TacOp idea. I understand why you don't want to give something concrete because it is hard to be when we're speaking so broadly. But do you think the tier list for the TacOps changes between ITD and open board? By which I mean, do you think that maybe Recon might be the strongest pack to select on open board, but maybe it's like second or third actually on ITD. So for those teams that have got like 4 or so like archetypes they could pick from, is that when you're like changing it around?
Yeah, that is a fantastic point. You know what? I think there's some merit to that. There genuinely is. I would need to do a little bit more thought on it. But I think you're right. I think Seek and Destroy is probably better on ITD.
Yeah.
And there's a few reasons why, right? Like, let's say you're doing Rob and Ransack. Normally, what you're worried about on open board when you're playing Rob and Ransack is that you kill a guy, and then that model that you've used to kill them gets killed, right? And if you can be shot from across the board by a sniper, that's actually very easy to do. But let's say that you're in a sealed room on one flank, and that was the last model on that flank. Well, there's no way that they can get to them, right? And so suddenly you go, boom, instant TVP. And it can be anywhere, right? Like they could whiff and they charge you in your deployment zone, and you just go, boom, on ransack, away you go. And also the range as well. Like it's hard. It's harder for there to be more models in range. So it's boom, suddenly you get it. So that's one example. But yeah, I think Seek and Destroy probably is the better option. Route going through the floor, like through walls, means it's not too bad to score, I guess. And I guess things like things like security is probably stronger because you know that there's more steps to get the distance, right? Like it's still significantly harder for your opponent to come all the way across the board or sit on the center line because they have to commit more. So yeah, I think you're probably right. I would probably put Seek and Destroy at the top, then Recon, then Security, then Infiltrate. But maybe I'm being a little bit harsh on Infiltrate and stuff. I need to have a think about it. Maybe we need to do a ITD TacOps tier list.
Yeah.
We can do that.
All right. Let's move on to...
That brings us to the end of the episode. Hopefully you found something new or useful while listening, and if you did, throwing us a like would be greatly appreciated. If you want to make sure you don't miss any episodes, make sure you hit that subscribe button and click on the bell so you get notifications as soon as the next one drops. It really is the best way to help a small channel like ours. And if you can't wait and you do want early access, we have a Patreon where you get exclusive access to all our content ahead of time. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback. Just drop a comment below and we'll get right to you. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host Ryan. This has been Turning Point Tactics, and we'll see you next week.